So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alan Fraser. I'm the scientific coordinator of this European Union Horizon project called CoreMD, and this is our 10th webinar now. You will find that we have had a whole series of discussions online during the past 12 months. And these are the titles, which I will not go through now, but they relate to a lot of separate tasks within our project, looking at the regulatory evidence and the methodologies in the approval processes for high-risk medical devices. All of these are available for review through our website. You can follow this quick response code to go directly to the page with all the webinars listed with access. And also on this slide, I'm showing our general website homepage, where you will find a lot more information about our project. The overall goal of CoreMD has been to develop methodological approaches for improved clinical investigation and evaluation of high-risk medical devices. And when we were proposing our project, we recognized that currently the medical device regulation in Europe does not really adequately address particular challenges relating to the approval of genuinely innovative new high-risk medical devices. And for example, secondly, also of orphan medical devices and including devices for children. So amongst the tasks that we proposed were several that address these issues. One from the University of Oxford on providing evidence during the early development of high-risk medical devices, and an overlapping project from the Andalusian Public Health Foundation and Health Technology Assessment Group on clinical evidence generation after market access and the use of conditions on certificates of approval by notified bodies, which of course can be one way of addressing the need to collect more evidence for new devices. But today we're going to discuss particularly the context of task 2.1. And the title of this webinar is Early Clinical Investigations of New High-Risk Devices, and in particular, how the lack of transparency leads perhaps to reduced predictability and may therefore inhibit the improvements in evaluation of new devices. Peter McCulloch from the University of Oxford, who is a gastrointestinal surgeon by background and the lead of the IDEAL collaboration, is going to present his conclusions and results from the CoreMD project and task that he's been leading on early investigation. And then from outside our consortium, we're pleased to welcome Mark Slack, who's a gynecologist with an interest in urogynecological surgery in the past. And he was the founder of a spin-off company from the University of Cambridge for robots for surgical procedures. And he's going to give us, therefore, his perspective now as a manufacturer on challenges in implementing the medical device regulation as it relates particularly to early clinical investigation. And then thirdly, because we know that the use of new devices where there may be less evidence may carry increased risk, or at least may be associated with unknown risks, it's very important that we consider how those are managed with patients jointly. And so we're pleased to welcome Claudia Louati, who's the head of policy at the European Patients Forum, for the patient's perspective. And I should say that the EPF is also a partner within our consortium. And then as our chief discussant, we have Gearóid McGoran, who's a medical officer with the regulatory authority HPRA in Ireland. And his background was as a paediatrician, but he's now an active medical device regulator in the European Union on the Clinical Investigation and Evaluation Working Group and leading other task forces of regulators addressing some of these questions. So we will try to have our presentations within 45 minutes and leave up to 30 minutes for discussion. This webinar is being recorded as the others were, and so it will also be available soon for review. We're using Zoom, and that means that participants are in lecture mode. So unfortunately, it's not possible for colleagues to speak directly, but we do ask you please to put questions and comments in the Q&A chat box. The other chat box is just for discussion with our moderator, but therefore we use the Q&A, and we will monitor that and try and address as many questions as possible in the discussion at the end of this webinar. If you would like more information, then of course go to our website and register for the newsletter. And I just finally want to mention that there will be a few more webinars before we finish. There is one scheduled provisionally for the 4th of March on patient-reported outcomes. You'll get the information about that on the website. And our final dissemination event is an open public conference, one-day meeting in Brussels on Friday, the 15th of March, on regulatory science for high-risk medical devices. I've listed here some of the key topics that we will address, and we invite colleagues and all of you who are interested either to attend in person or, because this will be a hybrid meeting, to follow it online. So now I'll stop sharing and ask Peter McCulloch, please, from Oxford, to start our discussion with his presentation.
Right. Well, as Alan has eloquently explained, the CoreMD project is focused on a problem we have in the European Union, which is how to provide adequate clinical evaluation for medical devices. And I'd like to explain the piece of work that we've been doing in terms of the reasons why that is a problem. Our aim was to understand the factors facilitating and inhibiting the uptake of new methods for regulatory clinical evidence development, because it was clear that the existing methods were not fit for purpose. And to do this, we evaluated the uptake and use of the ideal format studies, which are something that are very much part of my background, as a method of providing clinical evidence for CE marking. This project arose in part from an earlier study I had done with colleagues in the British MHRA, looking at the MDR and trying to work out how ideal format studies could support it. We suggested at that time that some of the particular studies in the ideal toolbox could be very useful in terms of CE marking. But many of you have probably not heard of ideal. It originally arose in response to the difficulties of evaluating surgical operations. And what it is basically an analysis of the life cycle of complex therapeutic interventions, including both operations and devices, and an analysis following on from that of what is needed to evaluate them properly at each of those stages in the life cycle. So it's very much life cycle based. And we aim in ideal to provide an integrated evaluation pathway for these therapeutic interventions, analogous but different to the one that's been used for many years in drugs, which is why drugs and pharmacological products do not have this problem. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide some of the recommendations for the different parts of the life cycle in ideal. The ideal framework was, as I've said, based on trying to work out the life cycle of complex innovations like operations. And we discovered during this process interesting things like, for instance, after the first in human event, there is almost inevitably a stage of rapid iteration where the device or operation is changed in response to observations made in early cases. This may not last very long, but during this stage, the intervention clearly is not stable, so comparative studies are not appropriate. This is followed by a second stage in which other innovators and clinicians join in trying to use the device, and they may use it in different ways, they may use it in different people, they may find it difficult to agree on a definition of exactly what the intervention is. And the aim of studies in the second stage is to try and reach this consensus. The third stage, assessment, is the one at which we expect to do comparative evaluation of efficacy in a randomized trial. And the fourth stage, long-term monitoring, is analogous to that in pharma products. What the life cycle studies showed was that there are key specific difficulties which explain why complex invasive therapies are more difficult to study. There is this need for iterative modification early on in clinical practice, regardless of all the bench studies that may have been performed beforehand. And there's need for achievement of consensus between different operators and an assurance that all operators are adequately skilled. There is a very important issue around learning curves amongst evaluators here to ensure variation in delivery quality doesn't spoil the evaluation. Finally, there are problems with equipoise, both with clinicians and innovators who tend to feel much more closely associated with the treatment than with pharma products, and with patients whose views tend to reflect theirs. The ideal evaluation pathway, therefore, and this shows you the reasons for the acronym IDEAL, has 5 stages, and the randomized trial only occurs in stage 3 which is really the 4th stage of the 5. The innovation of IDEAL is in the 2 prior stages. The recommendations that IDEAL has set for these are to do prospective cohort studies in stage 2A, carefully documenting any iterative changes, the reasons for them and their outcome, and in stage 2B, seeking to understand learning curve issues and to reach consensus among investigators. In the CORE-MD study, we engaged with partners in the subgroups of CORE-MD, so the EFORT Orthopedic Colloquium and the European Cardiology Society, looking for people who were developing devices and would be interested in trying to use ideal format studies to prepare clinical evidence for CE marking. We also sent out an appeal for others who might be interested in joining the project through the IDEAL Advisory Service. We helped them to co-design IDEAL 2A and 2B studies and studied both their views on what happened and exactly what the outcomes were. We recruited 11 groups from CORE-MD and 9 from other sources, all developing high-risk devices. And we found that their interest in ideal format and their approval of the theory was very high. We supported them as promised and used questionnaires and qualitative interviews to evaluate their impressions and views on the outcomes and why they came about. The list on the right-hand side shows some of the innovations that we were studying. This slide summarizes the outcome as far as progression to using ideal studies in CE marking clinical evaluation packages is concerned. You'll concede that, in fact, only one of the CORE-MD projects actually made it to a submission for regulatory approval. The percentage success rate was slightly better in those who were not members of the CORE-MD colloquium, but this may have been because they were already interested in IDEAL and had applied to us rather than the other way around. This slide shows the results of a questionnaire we put to people, trying to ask them for what was the importance of various aspects on the use of IDEAL. In black at the top are 2 neutral questions asking whether baseline knowledge and support were important. Baseline knowledge was quite important, support less so. In the middle, we asked 3 important questions about acceptance. And in each case, we saw that acceptance by regulators, by journal editors, and by funders were considered very important factors in terms of people's concerns about using IDEAL, because there was very little evidence to back up and support the idea that regulators in particular would accept this. There was very broad support for the validity of IDEAL, and there were very few concerns about the idea that IDEAL might increase finance or effort requirements or the time frame for investigations. From the interview studies, we picked up indications which were very much in harmony with these questionnaire findings. There was high confidence in the validity of IDEAL and little concern about difficulties in use. No concerns about effects and cost and delays, but major concerns about uncertainty about whether IDEAL would be well received by notified bodies and regulators. And of course, the key issue here is that current regulatory and legal barriers exist in allowing notified bodies to communicate with innovators about this. And therefore, not surprisingly, innovators who had major risks in presenting their clinical evidence packages tended to take a safety first approach and withdraw from using IDEAL because it did not have a track record of success. This is an important general conclusion, I think, because it suggests that any new methodological techniques are liable to suffer the same fate in a situation where the intentions and requirements of the notified body are entirely opaque. We therefore concluded that the current EU system prevents communication between the innovator and notified body, and the effect of this, as demonstrated in a live pilot study, is that it's a strong inhibitor on innovation and improvement in clinical evidence development. And I would therefore conclude that ways of neutralizing this barrier to predictability in assessment are urgently required. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And while you're stopping sharing your screen, let me ask you one first question, and then we can come back to other topics later during the general discussion. I think you're showing us that your approach that you've developed with colleagues in your IDEAL consortium, your IDEAL project, is logical, that there should be a staged, progressive accumulation of evidence balancing risks and iteration and evidence. But the issue there is at which stage there would be sufficient evidence for regulatory approval or for an application for regulatory approval. And I know we've discussed this before, because what you're doing with IDEAL doesn't especially match the new requirements in the European Union Medical Device Regulation, particularly the request to have more clinical evidence before approval. And you refer to pivotal trials, or to randomized trials, I should say, in the fourth stage of your sequence. But that would probably be rather late to get evidence for regulatory approval under the European system currently. You've discussed this with regulators in the UK before it left the European Union. Any thoughts about how this impacts now on the situation within the European Union? And then we'll come back to more general comments from other colleagues later.
Well, Alan, thanks. Yes, you have asked me that question before, and the answer is, as before, that I don't know. The reason that we did what we did in our original paper was that it was clear that if a threshold was set, and having demonstrated that a device had passed entirely through the stage 2A process and was now stable, that would actually be considerably more than the average evidence, published evidence, that we saw in devices that were getting CE marking approval in contemporary studies at that time. The MDR does call for more evidence, but it does so in a very vague way. And it's entirely unclear whether the threshold is to be raised or raised dramatically. We've had discussions, you and I and others, around the view that perhaps moving up to IDEAL stage 2B, which would be a large prospective collaborative cohort study, might be a reasonable compromise. But I haven't really found anybody with the confidence that they know what's going to happen next with the MDR to tell me whether that's an appropriate threshold so far. And I think it's up for grabs.
Yeah, well, let's come back to that a little bit later. For the time being, let's move on and ask Mark Slack for his views. Mark, you're going to give us your perspective, I think, both as a clinical academic from previous occupations and now from the perspective of a company, on how you can collect evidence for early stages of approval of a new device. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. So, as Alan said earlier, I was a clinical academic in Cambridge, who've been involved in device introduction over a large part of my career, the most recent being the development from scratch of a soft tissue robotic system for the performance of minimal access surgery in all anatomical frameworks from the mouth via the chest to the abdomen and pelvis. The aim of the project was to show that the robotic system could match minimal access surgery in terms of outcomes, but also to demonstrate that it is easier to learn and has some advantages for patients on there. The big thing, which I'll start with before I go through my slides, is to say that, of course, what people forget is that in the pharmaceutical industry, the returns on blockbuster drugs are in the billions of pounds per annum, whereas that is not the case in a device. And yet the potential complications of the device are everything to match that. One of my colleagues, who is the chief medical officer of a large pharmaceutical company, has a budget of 900 million a year. I assure you, I don't have anything like that in my budget. And when we talk glibly about trials such as cohort studies, randomized controlled trials, and so on in the clinical framework, especially with surgery, you must realize that for a cohort study in surgery, you'd be lucky to get away with a trial on less than 1.4 million. And in a prospective randomized controlled trial, you can push that up towards the 4 to 5 million mark. So these are considerable barriers to doing some of the research. And next slide, please. The big concern I have at the moment is that the European regulatory framework, which was introduced in 2017, laudably to increase safety and quality of medical devices, may in fact be going some way to inhibiting that. It pretty much means that several thousand medical devices that are already in daily use will need new approval under the guidelines being proposed. And the question we have to ask is, do the benefits of the new MDR regulation outweigh the possible negative impact of the legislation? Impact on patients. It may cause a delay in patient access to devices, and evaluation of older devices, and I'll come back to that in another slide, could retard introduction of new devices, thus ultimately compromising patients. And the MDR will actually markedly increase costs associated with increased clinical evaluation, the access to data, and new methods of post-marketing surveillance. And I'll come back to mentioning IDEAL at the end as something I've thought of as a possible solution. Next slide, please. So the impact at the moment is this need to reevaluate and recertify existing devices, the need to conduct additional clinical testing and data collection. I'm not against higher medical standards. We've all lived and seen the problems associated with random device introduction, but it's not always been just the method that's been done. It might sometimes have also been involved with dishonesty alongside it. MDR may lead to a reduction of innovation as companies are forced to focus on recertification of products that they already have. And the big concern for Europe is that the MDR changes may push work in the direction of the FDA, who's now perceived as a easier body to work with. Next slide, please. When submitting to the FDA, what you do have at the moment is the Q-Sub process. That means that I can obtain feedback prior to intended pre-market submission. I can ask questions about trial design, sample size, and pretty much all the other technical files that I may need. And the time frame for obtaining market approval is now getting significantly shorter. And of course, from a business perspective, it allows access to a much larger market, which is actually 43% of the global market share. So it's going to drive people from wanting to get access to about 16% of the global market to consider something like that. When submitting to the EU, the European Association for Medical Devices of notified bodies estimates a capacity of 6,300 certificates a year, but 14,000 are set to expire in 2024 alone. and therefore we can see a looming difficulty. Many notified bodies are now not taking new clients or extensions of transition period because they basically don't have the capacity. And people are now also recommending that you go to multiple notified bodies at the same time, which is a fairly haphazard way. The notified bodies and approved bodies are forbidden from having a meeting with manufacturers pre-submission, and therefore we get to this lack of transparency that's been mentioned once or twice. There has been some work towards an innovative devices access pathway, but I'm not sure that I've actually seen where that's going and where it's landing. Next slide, please. I believe that there is marked uncertainty and changes in the regulation, and these present a whole set of new challenges. I'm not sure of which I have all the answers. There's limited approved body and notified body capacity, which certainly needs to be dealt with, or risk pushing work well away from the European Union at some speed. The structure of the MHRA, and I believe that there should be separation of devices and medicines because they have very different ways of being evaluated. And we need a far greater transparency when trying to work out what is needed to do appropriate studies and trials. We also need to look at the utilization of existing off-label data, which is there. It seems ethically immoral just to ignore data which is available. We need to look at the use of real-world data in the form of registries and so on, both in the evaluation of products and in the post-market surveillance of them. And we also need different methods of evaluation. I can be fairly critical of randomized controlled trials, sometimes in surgical trials, given that there are many ways that they can be introduce a bias of their own. And I do think we need to look at different methods of evaluation. And I have certainly spoken at some length to the IDEAL group about trying to design trials around it. That, of course, also produces a problem for a manufacturer and for an industry, because you don't always want to come out and demonstrate the weakness of your product publicly. And so that's quite a difficult one to consider from the business point of view. But I do think that if we look at different ways, we can actually make it, one, both more affordable, and two, even more accurate. And I think as an example of pediatric surgery, which is one of the areas that I'm evaluating at the moment with the robot, and there are a lot of unrealistic and unscientific pressures put onto the studies wanted here. And we've got to be very careful that this will just drive products to be used off-label with very little evidence behind them. So I'll leave it at that and then leave time for questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Mark. May I ask you, firstly, you've presumably as a company had experience applying for approval in different regulatory jurisdictions, both in the USA and in the European Union, and probably Canada, Australia, China, all sorts of other places, Japan. Have you any thoughts about how they compare in terms of the amount of evidence required, and particularly evidence during the early stage development?
Well, it's part of a journey there as well, Alan, because when we started, we were under the Medical Device Directive, and therefore the levels of evidence required were considerably lower to get a CE mark. And then as we've gone into the MDR, that has raised the bar considerably. People like the TGI in Australia, if you have a CE mark, will pretty much allow you in and give you some form of acceptance, whereas Japan and China have their own regulatory frameworks as well, which are quite different and changing at the moment. And of course, then there's the FDA. And I have seen a very big change. I've done a number of presentations to the FDA over the last 20 years, and there's a considerable change in their approach. They are very transparent. They communicate freely and give direction in some areas as well, which makes it far easier to develop your product. The other thing people must realize as well now is that if I'm developing something as complex as a soft tissue robot, the iterations will never stop. We will never stop changing it. So every 6 months, it gets completely upgraded software. The instruments are changing all the time, which creates a real difficulty in having to freeze a design while you do the next phase of the study. And then if the design carries on being changed, when the next one is released, you then have to do a gap analysis and a reapplication. So it can make it very, very tricky.
I wouldn't ask you to disclose which notified bodies you use in Europe, but have you always just used one, or have you used several different ones?
No, we have used 3 in total.
So may I ask then, that's the question without being specific, because these relationships are confidential. That's one of the issues in Europe, as we know. But once you have registered with a notified body, you can get advice from them. I think the problem is getting advice from them collectively as notified bodies and publicly and transparently before you commit to working with an individual company for the approval of your product. But you do get advice once you've got a relationship and maybe signed a contract with a notified body. But my question would be whether you found that the advice from 3 different notified bodies was different or similar, or was it unpredictable from your perspective as a manufacturer?
I think it's different, and I think it's unpredictable, and I don't think that the advice is always transparent. Some are much better than others, and there's a little bit of sitting on the fence with people giving a degree of advice, but tending to be quite nuanced and quite bland and quite middle of the road. And that is a problem when you've got something as complex as I'm developing.
I think that supports what Peter was saying about his insights from the companies he's spoken to. So we'll come back to that. Thank you very much. But let's move on to Claudia, who's going to talk to us, I think, about the perspective of patients when we're balancing risk with benefit and consent in early stages of devices. Welcome, Claudia. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Indeed. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Indeed, I will cover the perspectives of patients on this important topic. So I'll start with some initial considerations to set the scene, from the patient perspective. We all agree, that medical devices are not goods like any other. They have important patient safety and important implications for patients. Innovation can indeed transform the life of patients with lifelong conditions, but there is no universal definition of what innovation means. And in our view, really, there is a need to involve patients in defining what innovation means from their standpoint, what new really means. And in our view, it's about the concrete added benefits to patients that new devices bring. The second consideration is about what is an effective legal or regulatory framework for clinical investigations. First of all, it's a framework that ensures that the rights, safety, dignity, and well-being of subjects are protected and prevail in all circumstances. That's the legal definition. It sounds obvious, but I think it's always important to remind ourselves of that. Second point is that it's supposed to ensure that new devices are properly tested before they are authorized for marketing and use. Mark has reminded us of why the regulations were adopted in the first place, and I think there was, and there still is, a need to significantly strengthen the level and the quality of the evidence that is provided, especially for high-risk devices. But at the same time, it's also about avoiding unnecessary burdens to support patients' timely access to safe and effective innovations. Of course, administrative burdens, disharmonized frameworks are not in the interest of patients, and at the end of the day, they hinder access to safe innovations. And in that sense, I think we can also use the example of medicines where there are specific pathways for those medicines that provide potentially significant benefits and that are very promising. Those pathways provide the oversight that is needed in order to ensure the patient safety, while at the same time accelerating innovation. And I think something similar could be also considered for devices. And the final point here is that patients provide the information and ultimately manage the personal risks attached to their participation in clinical trials or in clinical investigations. And in that sense, really highlights the importance of transparency. Patient information is very key, and I will address it throughout this presentation. So I'll focus indeed on three key aspects. So first of all, the meaningful informed consent, which is really a key and a cornerstone for good clinical investigations. Easy access to high quality information regarding the trial and the results, as well as finally perhaps most important point, which is meaningful patient involvement across all aspects of clinical investigations. So starting with the meaningful informed consent. Really, it's a core prerequisite, as we know, for enrolling any person in a clinical trial. We see this as a process, really a decision aid that should enable the patient to make a meaningful decision as to whether or not they will participate in a given study. Regrettably, there are still large disparities in informed consent across the EU, both in terms of the quality, the quantity of the information provided, as well as the effectiveness of the process. It's often just a tick box exercise, and it's mainly considered as a legal document rather than really a crucial means by which patients are able to fully comprehend and evaluate the risks and the potential benefits they will be taking in participating in the investigation. So in that sense, patients often do not recognize written consent as serving their interest, but rather the interest of researchers and hospitals really as a way to cover themselves. So in that sense, there's really a lot of effort still that can be made to make informed consent truly meaningful. And we believe that patient organizations and patients must be involved in developing and helping develop the documents in order to ensure that actually they provide the information that patient needs. The second point, which is slightly related, is about high quality information. And all patients, of course, have fundamental right to access information, and they should have access to the same level of information wherever they are in the EU. And again, we know that there are a lot of disparities in different member states. So there are various, aspects of information, various moments where patients will look for information. So, for example, when they're interested in what trials are ongoing, what devices are currently being tested. Of course, for patients that are part of the clinical investigations, it's about knowing what the clinical investigation is about, what are the objectives, how the evidence will actually serve a certain purpose. And then, of course, for once the device is on the market, it's important to have access to adequate information in order to know about the device, to have the trust that the device has been properly evaluated, and making sure that the evidence is robust. So again, that links to several dimensions of information for patients, and highlights perhaps the lack of currently the lack of information and the lack of transparency that exists in the system. It's very difficult to know what clinical investigations are currently ongoing and how to enroll. What the clinical investigations are about is similarly related to the informed consent. And in terms of the results and the outcomes of the trial as well, for now, the information that is needed is still lacking. But there is hope that might change, at some point that might improve a little bit, at least once the EUDAMED is available. But again, it's unclear what information will actually be available and whether the database will be truly user-friendly. There are a number of other questions, that relate to the information that patients are seeking as part of clinical investigations, especially when they're participating in them. One of them is about the post-trial follow-up. What does it mean, after the trial is finished? Will I still have access to the intervention? What is considered? What are the links between the researchers, the funding, the sponsors, the institutional affiliations? What are the potential conflicts of interest? That's also something that patients should be aware of. And of course, So that leads me really to the final point, which is about patient involvement. And here I would really like to emphasize that this is really the core, of making a patient-centric research and development process for medical devices. And really, we believe that patients should be involved from designing research priorities to trial design and review of proposals to trial implementation and publication. So patients have this very specific experience of their own diseases, of what they expect from medical devices, and how they view the risk and benefit of devices compared to their own conditions. And in that sense, I think they have a very unique perspective that needs to be taken into account. It has also been showed in various research pieces that patient involvement actually supports meaningful innovation, so innovation that matters to patients and that actually brings something new and something of added value. There are a number of benefits. So, of course, enhances the legitimacy, the transparency, and the accountability. So when you have external stakeholders involved, it usually helps bringing out the value of the investigation that is ongoing. Improved design of trials as well. So when patients are involved, they can also provide input on the criteria for recruitment, on the endpoints that are relevant to them, which can also lead to fewer dropouts. And they help obviously challenge the assumptions of researchers, which can also bring some positive value to the research. So in that sense, really, one of the questions that we get sometimes is how to make it happen in practice, how to involve patients. So I think it's about creating the space to ensure that patients are able to provide that advisory role, engaging with patient organizations, for example, to have their input. They represent their community, and they're often able to provide, the link with their members and to provide that input in that sense. And of course, inclusion in the decision-making processes. So ensuring that patients are involved in ethics reviews, for example, and in ethics committees at various levels. So some regulators have already put guidance as to how to make this happen in practice and how to make it relevant for the regulatory decision-making process. So that's the case of the FDA. And I think that provides a very strong signal that this is something that is valued. So again, patient involvement, I think, is valid across the life cycle and something that needs to be very much supported also through capacity building. So I'll stop here and I'll look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Claudia. It's a very clear presentation and a very strong case. Again, while you're stopping sharing your screen,
yes,
may I just ask you, obviously, the choice of how much information, we still have your screen, that's it, thank you.
Yeah.
The choice of how much information a patient will want will be an individual decision. And we, of course, try and respect that whenever we get consent for a study or to use a device or perform an operation. But I want to ask you if you have any collective view from the European Patients Forum on this issue of managing consent when we don't know what the risks are. Because with innovation, we're asking for support to evaluate new devices where there may be limited experience. And clearly it will depend on the potential benefit versus the risks of the disease. But have you any views on how we should approach asking for consent or sharing information when we don't know what the risks are going to be because it's an early stage of the development of a new procedure or a new device?
Yeah. So, no, it's a very interesting question. I think it's difficult to give a blanket answer. I don't think there is one true response as to whether patients prefer risks or don't prefer risks. Again, it's about asking them, so, and making it transparent when we're asking for the informed consent. I think in some cases, it's perfectly understandable that the researchers don't necessarily have a lot of information, although they do always have information before starting those initial trials, and they need to make sure that the preclinical phase has been done accurately and comprehensively. And I think based on that evidence already, it provides some reassurance to patients that the different steps have been taken. So I can't answer your question in a better way, in the sense that we don't have, surveys about patients' willingness, acceptance of risks. But at the same time, again, it's an individual thing. And as long as the process is transparent, and as long as patients are involved and able to express their own views on the risk benefits, I think, the conditions are there.
Indeed. So before we come to a general discussion, I'd like first to invite Gearóid McGoran from the Irish Regulatory Authority for his reactions. And Gearóid, do you mind if I just introduce you with a comment on what we know are some of the initiatives that are going on within Europe now, addressing the issue of early phase development of new devices? Because I think it is recognised that there is a challenge now for the medical device regulation, and there is widespread comment from manufacturers and investigators that early phase studies are moving outside Europe, for example, to North America. Mark referred to that. So can I just mention several things? Firstly,
Please, yeah.
you may tell us that more about the regulatory authorities who have a dialogue with investigators when you approve clinical trial protocols. That's the first thing that happens. Secondly, we know that notified bodies may give advice, although we've heard that that doesn't always work well. But they have the capacity to do that once they have an agreement, and therefore can respect confidentiality with a manufacturer. The European Medicines Agency, which now manages expert panels, has also been asked by the Commission to set up an early advice system. And now there are early dialogues and questions with the expert panels being trialled. The first 10 cases are undergoing and will be reported during this year. And then we will see if that would work and whether that might address some of the problems that have been raised. Then fourthly, we know that the European Commission has commissioned expert support for advice from EY, which is a legal and consultancy company, to survey opinions about innovative devices and how they're introduced within the European Union. And then lastly, I'm aware, as you may be, of a new IHI, a European Union research project that's going to be led by Bocconi University on a harmonized approach to early feasibility studies. So within this space, there's a lot of recognition and a lot of different things going on, but they're probably not very well coordinated, and they're not making a difference to the manufacturer yet, I would suppose. But Gearóid, please give us your view from the regulatory side and from European Union committees that you attend, please.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I appreciate it. And firstly, I'd like to thank the three previous speakers for their perspectives. As a regulator, I think it's extremely important to hear those perspectives. And over the last few years in particular, I think regulators have become increasingly and acutely aware of the challenges facing manufacturers, academics, patients, and members of the public since the application of MDR, particularly a big challenge is around this predictability and the transparency across the system. And it is something that we have been working hard on for the last few years in particular. And I do want to touch on your points, Alan, and on the points of the previous speakers. I might just give just very high level context, just for those who are on the call who may not have been part of any of the other webinars or may not be fully familiar with the European system. I just very high level overview. For those who don't know, in order for a device to be placed on the market, they need to show that they conform with European law. For medical devices, this is MDR, the Medical Device Regulation. There's a separate law for diagnostic devices, like lab tests, that they're subject to the IVD, the In Vitro Diagnostic Regulation. And in order for the device to receive its CE mark, it needs to undergo a conformity assessment. And for most devices, that is carried out by a notified body. The notified body is separate to a regulatory authority. So I am, as Alan introduced me, I'm a member of the Irish Regulatory Authority. We don't issue CE certs or do conformity assessments of medical devices, that's the role of the notified body. But what we do is we regulate and oversee the practices of the notified bodies, amongst other actions, to make sure that they are complying with the MDR. Currently, there are over 40 notified bodies designated to assess devices under the MDR, and I believe at least 12 notified bodies under the IVDR. And that number has substantially increased over the last year to 18 months. And I think this links in somewhat with Mark's point about the limitations in capacity for notified bodies. Indeed, that was seen as a critical issue by regulators. Even in 2022, we issued a statement identifying high concerns about the notified body capacity issue, and since then we've put in efforts to try and improve the capacity of notified bodies, and as well as reduce the critical nature, the acuity of this crisis, and including prolonging the transitional provisions to allow more time for notified bodies and manufacturers to come into compliance with the MDR. Obviously, that is only a stopgap, and we need to get more definitive solutions going forward. But that is something that needs to be acknowledged. But I suppose, as I've described it, it is an extremely decentralized system. You have one law for medical devices and indeed another one for IVDs. That is applied across 27 EU member states, each with their own regulatory authorities that may have their own interpretations of the law. This then, of course, leads to a burden and uncertainty for the 40 plus notified bodies, who then have to try and anticipate how their regulatory authority is going to interpret that law, and they will make their own interpretations, and that in turn is going to lead to further confusion for the manufacturers, who are trying to second guess themselves in anticipation for applying to the notified body. And to Peter McCulloch's point about that, prior to the MDR, there was much more free discussion and engagement between the notified body and the manufacturer about what is needed from clinical evidence perspective. But with the MDR and the IVDR, they prohibit so-called consultancy between notified bodies and manufacturers, and that was partly due to certain high-profile cases under the old system of inappropriate consultancy. But I fully accept that those barriers, they are indeed, as you called it, Peter, a significant barrier to notified bodies and manufacturers to be able to easily engage, and for manufacturers to understand what is it that's needed, how much evidence are the notified bodies expecting. And that is a challenge that we're trying to address. One of the aspects that is work is ongoing, that I would hope would be published later on this year, is specific guidance on so-called structured dialogue between notified bodies and manufacturers. What is an acceptable level? What is too far? That would be inappropriate consultancy, and what is a certain amount of level that is allowed within the context of structured dialogue between notified bodies and manufacturers. And but I accept that needs to be that needs to be priority. That the regulators need to publish, and they are working on that. One of the other key areas so I suppose since the application of the MDR, when we were initially drafting the MDR, one of the key areas that needed improvement in the European system was actually transparency, predictability, and coordination across the European Union, to make sure that these laws are being applied evenly and equally and fairly across the EU. And the overall aim of the MDR was to establish a more robust, transparent, and predictable and sustainable regulatory framework for medical devices, which ensures a high level of safety and health, whilst also supporting innovation. So it's a balance that we have to try and focus, that we make it sure that we are appropriately regulating it, that balances that need for safety, good coordination, and supporting of innovation.
Gerard, I wonder if I might interrupt already, because you just mentioned transparency.
Yeah.
You really think that's working? Because it's a theme that has come out from all the other presentations.
Yeah.
And without the notified bodies being able to give open advice that is then shared with other developers of similar products, is that really going to work? Because I personally think that transparency is one of the major problems that we have here. And you refer to it as a goal of the MDR, but without a fundamental revision, do you really feel that that's operating? And I can see that Peter would like to come in on that as well.
Well, I suppose the phrase transparency, I think, and predictability are they're used interchangeably sometimes. I think when we talk about transparency, I do think there are certain aspects of the MDR that will greatly improve the transparency from a public health, from patient and healthcare professionals if it's executed appropriately. Now, I think a big problem is something that the transparency improvement relies heavily upon is UDEMED, is the European database for medical devices,
but that
which
also,
is delayed.
But also, if I can again comment, that's on the data after a device has been approved.
Yes.
The evidence for a new device will be published, which is tremendous. And of course, we need that. It's obvious. But we're talking now about before it's approved and the evidence and the transparency of the requirements that are expected by different notified bodies for new devices. That's not public yet, is it?
Well, it's not yet, and I suppose that is something that we're working on. So there's lots of activities. You've mentioned certain activities ongoing already across the EU level that you've kindly identified. Not only just the European funded projects like CoreMD, which is trying to establish more scientific guidance, and there's further follow-on projects across EU for that. There's a pilot, so there is a pilot project ongoing within the European Medicines Agency expert panel, as you mentioned, to try and give more granular scientific advice for manufacturers on what is expected and on what is an expected level of clinical evidence. But there are also there's also significant work going on within the MDCG, which is the Medical Device Coordination Group, which is the central group of regulators chaired by the Commission, which again was established with the MDR. It didn't exist prior to the MDR under that name, and that has been issuing large volumes of guidance. Now, and the admission, and again from previous webinars we've discussed, a lot of the guidance issued by MDCG has been quite procedural in nature and not very scientific, and there's a much more of an emphasis, and we know that there's much more of an emphasis going forward to make more scientifically meaningful guidance. So an example of work that we're doing, we're creating, as many people will know, we're rapidly developing guidance on orphan devices, which these are devices for rare diseases with unmet clinical need, to the point that Claudia had made about the importance of unmet clinical need. And one of the aspects we're exploring is the role of patient engagement and patient involvement at that point. But that will be more scientific and based in nature. And finally, I suppose another large scale input would be the updates to the medical device, so the guidance on clinical evaluation of medical devices in general. The previous 2016 version was applicable to the directives. We're doing a huge amount of work to update it, to make it relevant to MDR, but also to revise certain sections to make it more scientifically meaningful and to actually, and more practical, to try and exactly bolster it. I think the principles of improved transparency within the MDR, I think, are good. I do think the execution is poor as yet. I think extremely reliant on UDEMED being established. But if UDEMED is established, there'll be, again, as I said, better transparency for end users. But I do accept that we're extremely limited in what we can do in a decentralized system. And I think to again, Mark and Peter's points again, and I'll finish now. I'll finish after this. You've made reference to, and actually Claudia's as well. The FDA, MHRA now, the TGA, and the Japanese authorities, and indeed the EMA for medicines. Obviously, they are centralized, and they are the one house. They are the regulatory authority as well as being the authorizing bodies. And by it being centralized, it is easier for them to develop a more centralized interpretation of the law, and that is what we're trying to aspire towards within MDCG, trying to remove these 27 plus interpretations of the law to try and make a better, broader consensus, to make it more predictable and more transparent for everyone involved.
Thank you, Geroid, and let's come back to some of those issues. But before I bring you in, Peter, can I just refer to the comment from Mohammed El-Zawari on the chat, when he said if there's no forum or informal panel to discuss plans with a regulator, would it not be best to create such a space? And I think we all agree that we need these forums, but I think, Geroid, you can confirm that there are now 2 such initiatives already started or starting. One is that the clinical specialists within the notified bodies, through their trade association, now have established a monthly meeting of clinical evaluators at which they can share questions to develop a common approach to a particular type of device. And then secondly, I've heard recently that the regulatory agencies are also planning a joint discussion on common answers to proposals for clinical investigations. I think that's at the early stage, but both of those are being developed. And if I can now use an advocacy hat on behalf of the Biomedical Alliance in Europe rather than the CoreMD project, we're trying to encourage that conclusions from such discussions will be summarized in a transparent way so that people can see what's been agreed. I don't know if you want to respond very quickly.
Yeah, I can
That's correct, I think, isn't it?
I can briefly respond. Certainly, my understanding with the notified body colleagues is indeed that they're setting up a forum, and again, that's only again from speaking informally with them. From the regulator's perspective, again, MDCG, the aim of MDCG is to generally improve coordination across member states, across regulators within CIE, which is the subgroup I'm involved, which is the Clinical Investigation and Evaluation Working Group of MDCG. We have already been actively engaging to try and, we do frequently on an ad hoc basis discuss individual cases to try and understand, to make sure that we, and hypothetical scenarios to understand situations, that we make sure, so that we can make sure that regulators are consistently applying. And indeed, if you look at, say, we regularly update our guidance MDCG 2021-6. We've recently revised that, which is a questions and answers guidance on clinical investigations, including early clinical investigations. And if we find common recurring issues, to your point about having common opinions being disclosed, that is kind of what we're doing with that guidance document, the Q&A. Yeah. That when we reach a consensus about a commonly raised issue, we publish that way.
There are now literally scores of guidance documents on the Europa website, and probably colleagues don't look at those as much as they might. So thank you for that reminder. Yeah. There is also a comment from Professor Robin Ellison from Leiden, just confirming he's a member of one of the expert panels, a chair of one of the expert panels, that the early consultation pilots that have been done recently have been a very positive experience. And we're hoping once that's been reported that it will be developed much more. Now, we have a lot of questions to try and get through, but first, Peter, back to you, and thank you for waiting.
Oh, sorry. Right, yeah. Okay. I don't know, Helen. Listening to the conversation between Geroid and yourself makes me reflect. What would happen if you were approached by a person who'd invented a cart with square wheels and proposed that to improve it, they should round off the edges a wee bit and make the wheels smaller and improve the lubrication? That's very much the way I see these initiatives. I think the one that stands out as probably the most useful is the one that Geroid referred to as the structured dialogue. That sounds as if it has some hope of getting towards the degree of flexibility in allowing common sense conversations between innovators and evaluators that the Americans have. But I think the EU needs to look at this in terms of the competitive advantages. This has been brought up several times. Do we really think that this hodgepodge patchwork network of different initiatives is going to put us in a competitive condition with what the FDA have already got?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there are glaring logical problems with setting up expert panels instead of allowing evaluators, innovators to discuss how they're going to rigorously evaluate their products with the people who have to make the judgment. So expert panels were the very reason for the invention of evidence-based medicine and the domination of randomized trials that we have now. They were created exactly for that reason, because the FDA used to rely on them totally in the 1960s, and there was a tremendous demolition job done on them by David Sackett and colleagues, showing that they were always wrong.
Well,
so
you're raising
expert panels. No, hang on a minute. Give me I want to finish my point. So common specifications are, supposed to be common specifications of, if, as I understand it, what a device should be like, or what the evaluation of a device should be like. but that's putting the cart before the horse. You can't have common specifications until you don't know what the devices are going to be like that you're being put forward. So that's a logical nonsense as far as I can see. I mean, I think there is an alternative to, which is to admit that we made a mistake.
Well, Peter, let me interrupt, because what I was going to say was that you're raising wider issues, which I think are generally being recognized now within the European system from meetings that I attend, that the structural framework for regulation in Europe is not ideal. And we know that the medical device regulation includes the requirement for the Commission to report back to the European Parliament after 5 years on reflections about how it's working and whether or not it needs further change or evolution or revision. And the Commission Medical Devices Unit, the Medical Technology Unit, has already announced that it may try and bring that review forward, and that they'll be embarking on that process during this coming year, this calendar year. Now, I see a huge number of comments in the chat. Let me just summarize some of those and then ask the panelists for their impressions. I'm not quite sure where I should start, but you can read this, colleagues, as well. The expert panel, there's a statement saying that probably from a manufacturer or an investigator who has experience of the expert panel, stating that they were not able to comment on questions related to market access, because that's the issue of the notified body. So they were probably just advising on trial design at a European Union level jointly, which is a view from the expert panels to complement what the regulatory authorities do. There's a comment from Seref Akta saying, can the notified bodies ask for the information specifically that they need, and would that be called consulting? I think the issue that we've discussed, and Mark, you can confirm this, is that you can't get advice from a notified body until you've agreed to work with them. You can't go as an open consultation to notified bodies in general. Do you think transparency will improve for new class 3 implantable devices and 2B active devices, as notified bodies are required to request their clinical evaluation reports be reviewed in detail by expert panels? I think, Gerard, that's only for particular devices. It's not for all of them, and it's not in the case where there are already specific standards. And Tom Melvin is saying that structured dialogues, would that allow a notified body to propose a clinical study design before the company does an early stage study? And I think we all agree, and I think he knows that from asking the question, that it won't happen yet. So I've just picked out some of the issues, but could I start with you, Mark, and then ask Claudia and Peter again, bearing in mind the time we have left. If you were to look and reflect on what we've been discussing and to advise the Commission on what we need that doesn't yet exist in the European system and should be thought about during this reconsideration, what would your priorities be? Can I come to you first, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. The first one would be the transparency issue. There must be some way of actually discerning what they're looking for. Number two, my concern is, do the notified bodies have the knowledge to specify an appropriate study or design to evaluate safety? We've seen, we take something like vaginal mesh. It went through randomized controlled trials, went through all the regulatory hurdles, and still ended up in a mess, because they weren't considering using more modern ways of evaluation of outcomes like registries, et cetera, getting real-world data and real-world evidence from that. So my concern remains that the one group of people that aren't trained are the people that are the regulatory experts and so on. And it does seem to be a need for more training there and unification, and so that we all start to speak the same language. And I'm sure that's not impossible, but I suspect there are vested interests underneath it, with people wanting to stay independent because it has a profitable status to it. And until we can all start discussing, I think we're harming patients by actually not allowing any transparency into seeing what we need to do safely and effectively, and with value-based as well. cost effective.
Do you think they're not trained, or it's just that we don't know how trained they are? Because the new medical device regulation has quite strict requirements for the qualifications for reviewers. And what we've heard from notified bodies, some of which now have very large teams, is that they have a lot more clinical expertise than they used to under the device directives. What's your experience of that?
I think there's an improvement, but again, there's not, the access to it is not there. You know, I mean, if one goes out, if I had to go out and be critical, I'm quite supportive of the ideal collaborative process, but if I was going to be critical of randomized controlled trials and surgical trial design, I'd, you know, myself would, it's a debate that there's a lot of things to discuss. And while there are lots of advantages of randomized controlled trials, there are lots of disadvantages as well, and there's lots of errors within them. They can, and so that's the difficulty. I just find it very difficult to even steer a pathway down the middle, which is both scientific and cost effective and mostly safe for patients.
If you go to a large regulatory authority like the FDA, you will find a group of clinical experts within each field, and they manage all the inquiries so that they can develop progressively and be constant in what they say. And that's what's lacking in Europe. I think you'd agree with that.
Correct.
Okay. We just have a few more minutes before we should stop. So, Claudia, do you have any thoughts about how you, from the European Patients Forum, might like the system to change to make it easier to get access to genuinely innovative, needed new devices that are being studied at an early stage, but where the balance between benefit and risk looks promising?
Yeah, no, I think what we need really is a framework in place. I think we've been in transition now for many, many years. You know, this process of revising the regulation has been ongoing for many years, and I think there is no end in sight really as to when it will actually be implemented. There is a lack of guidance. There is a lack generally of certainty, you know, and that's not good for patients' access to the devices they need. So across the board, I think we really need a commitment to look at what the issues are and try to find a way to solve them together. And I think, you know, patients, there's a need also for a cultural shift, you know, more generally across the industry, and in how to involve patients, how to make sure, you know, that the patient sits at the heart of the development and of the marketing of devices. And I think that will help also this transition.
Thank you. So Peter and then Gerold, we do want to finish within a couple of minutes, but briefly, have you a couple of key points that you think would be the priorities for reform to address the challenge of early evaluation and approval of new devices in Europe?
Sure. And they match, I think, what Claudia and Mark are saying. I think number one is transparency, by which I mean transparency in having a specific conversation between an innovator and a regulator or a notified body about what is needed. And the other is to get some kind of predictability and harmonization between the notified bodies and between the different jurisdictions based on a life cycle-based framework where there's an agreed process. Just one last thing, which is to support what Claudia was saying about patients and consent. I think it's very important that we have a grown-up conversation with patients where we admit that if a device is very innovative, that automatically means that there are unknown risks, and we have to be upfront about that.
Thank you. And as you know, Peter, one of the tasks which we haven't discussed in Core MD is to try and develop a risk calculating tool that can be used as a help for decision making and for understanding unknown risks. Gerold, let me come to you. Maybe you don't want to say too much as a regulator, but if you have a couple of very brief points, what would your priorities be?
Well, the priority certainly is I've already mentioned about getting clarity on the structured dialogue between notified bodies and manufacturers, and that I think can't come quickly enough. I think just to clarify, the guidance that we're working on, I would like to see this, the guidance particularly on clinical evaluation of all devices. That guidance document, I'm optimistic at the scientific basis, and again the life cycle approach that guidance document is taking shape. So there's a lot more guidance and
it may be available this year.
Yeah. Hopefully, yeah. So real world data, registry data, that type of piece.
And your second point would be what then, please?
Well, so that would those would be the 2 points I would be aiming on. Yes, just more clarity on structured dialogue, and with the harmonization, be just more scientific basis of guidance. And I think by being more scientifically founded, you'll be able to harmonize and provide more consistent rules, granular rules that will then allow it to be more regulated across Europe in a more harmonized, consistent fashion.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you all for the interesting discussion and participants for joining us. We haven't covered all the points that were made, but we can try to answer a few more afterwards online. And we encourage you to contact us if you have further questions about the consortium, because we will be producing recommendations for this space as well from Peter McCulloch and his colleagues in Oxford, together with the other members of the consortium on related projects. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again on another occasion. Thank you.